Hi, Ed Chandler, and we are in the cool studio for this edition of Throwback Thursday, today featuring the ever-popular 45, or single, as some people called those. You know, the single actually got its start in the latter part of the 19th century with 10 and 12-inch discs that ran anywhere from 16 to 78 RPM. You probably remember some of those big, heavy things if you've been around that long, or you have some family that's been around that long. But the ones that we remember, of course, are this style. This is the 7-inch 45 RPM version, often called a single, even though it had a couple of songs on it. Record companies still called it a single. Most of us called it 45s. That didn't actually come out until RCA developed a way of putting 3 minutes worth of music onto a smaller format and making it quite affordable. The year that happened, 1949, just ahead of the advent of rock and roll. Now, what made these popular was the low cost and also the portability. So they're perfect for teenagers who were quickly adapting to rock and roll music. In fact, one of the most popular selling or best selling rock and roll singles or 45s of all time, Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock. I'm going to tell you the number one coming up here in just a little bit. But meantime, let's talk a little bit more about the 45. The biggest 45 popularity was between around 1955 and 1965. That was the biggest sales of this particular format because of this size and portability. It sold greatly to teenagers. Artists adapted it. But following 1965, artists started leaning towards more albums. As you got to the latter part of the 1960s, artists were also leaning towards more concept albums, which were tying a whole bunch of songs together. So rather than working on a single hit, they were working on multiple hits on an album or a concept album. In the 1970s, to help keep part of it alive, they started using, which they did on album covers as well, pictures on these 45s, and they still remain popular and quite inexpensive. When you think about it, they average anywhere from about $1 to $2 a piece. You got a couple of songs on there. One was a hit song. One wasn't necessarily a hit song, but may have been on the album that particular song came from. And so you've got a lot of things going on there. Still, the limitations were about 3 minutes until about the mid-1960s when Bob Dylan released Like a Rolling Stone. Originally, the record company split the single song, because it was over 6 minutes long, between two sides of the 45. Listeners rebelled and said, we want to hear the whole song in its entirety. Well, at the time, there was also the development of what they called microgroove technology, which allowed the record company to put more music on the side of a 45 and still have pretty good fidelity. Now, one of the things I didn't mention is all of the original 45s that RCA came out with were mono. So up until the early 1960s, stereo and 45 RPM records didn't even exist. Another little bit of trivia for you. Now back to the Bob Dylan story. Well, Bob, they came up with not only the technology, but also the want from the customer to put his song on the whole 6 minutes on one side. So, Like a Rolling Stone ended up being one of the songs, and a lot of people credit Bob Dylan for that, although there were probably others in the midst of that as well who were helping extend that. Meantime, album sales were also growing because artists were putting more songs on albums that were hits, and also in the latter part of the 60s coming up with more concept albums. So there was basically this little flip-flop between 45s and albums as far as sales. For record companies, of course, selling an album was a lot more money for them than this simple $1 to $2 45. Anyway, that's a look at our 45s. 45s, of course, gave way to tape. And also, of course, the record companies decided that they weren't making enough money. CDs came in. Just to wrap it up quickly for you, in the 1990s, it became as inexpensive to manufacture an entire album on a compact disc as it was a 45, and 45s got done away with. But in the 1970s and 80s, particularly in the 80s leading into the 90s, as 45s were being phased out by record companies, the internet also allowed for file sharing. So the record companies actually lost money by phasing out 45s. It was ultimately going to happen, but perhaps they were a bit premature. Now, we're going to get to the trivia. What was the number one selling 45 or single of all time? Bing Crosby's White Christmas. Yes, it was a Christmas song and a classic one at that. That had over 50 million sales, by the way. At over 30 million sales was Elton John's Princess to Diana, Candle in the Wind, that particular version of it, which did over 30 million copies. Others that did quite well, as I mentioned, were Bill Haley and the Comets, and one of the most popular singles of all time happens to be this one right here, the featured album for USA for Africa, We Are the World. And this is an original copy of that. Costs all of $1.99. Those are just a few of the great things that go along with this very popular format that your kids probably don't even remember. What's a 45? What's a single? Even though it has two different songs. That's our Cool 107.9 Throwback Thursday. Drag out your 45s if you've got an old player. Have some fun with that. If not, join me next week, because we are going to drag out an old record player that'll play some 45s with our Cool 107.9 Throwback Thursday. Don't forget, subscribe to our YouTube channel. That'll put you in touch with all of our Throwback Thursday series and a whole lot more. Look forward to seeing you next week with our Cool 107.9 Throwback Thursday.